The king is dead. We are really upset and angry, but he would not want us to do anything. Let's go home and let's consider this in the morning. Let's consider what we need to do to keep his memory alive.
They roamed back and forth across 7th Street, unhindered by the police, cheering as another plate glass window caved in.
Dr. King has been a buffer the last few years between the black community and the white community. The white people do not know it, but the white people's best friend is dead.
Hello, I'm Bruce Johnson, and thanks for joining us for this special edition of Off Script. Tomorrow marks 50 years since Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Within hours of his death in 1968, a brick was thrown through the window of the People's Drug Store at 14th and U Streets in Northwest. And for the next 4 days, many blocks of the nation's capital were consumed by riots and flames. We're going to begin this evening by looking back at the loss of Dr. King and hearing from people who were here when all hell broke loose.
Only way we can really achieve freedom.
Oh man, I was angry. Yeah, I was real angry. And I wanted somebody to pay.
Is to somehow conquer the fear of death.
The last thing he said to me was, "Don't ever hang up your marching shoes."
And then the next thing you know,
He got killed the next day.
For if a man has not discovered something that he will die for, he isn't fit to live.
Someone rushes in the door and says, Dr. King has been shot.
And it shocked me so, I just screamed.
I was headed back home to my mother's house. This would have been that Thursday, right before Palm Sunday, and I was going to have dinner, and I heard on the radio that he'd been shot.
Moved in January, Dr. King got killed in April, and looked like all hell broke loose.
when Dr. King was killed, we all went to the streets. If you were a teenager, and I was certainly a teenager back then, I was in the streets, not here in D.C., but in my hometown. I didn't burn anything down, but my friends certainly did. We were all out there. And if the National Guard, who were at the end of the block, had decided to fire into the crowds, they could have hit any one of us. We didn't care.
There wasn't no plan.
Right.
Everything just got out of control.
Just combustion, just things happening.
Yeah. Then they brought in the National Guard, and that made it even worse. Well, it's a couple of guys that grew up with me that ain't here no more. They got shot going in and out of stores.
You could sort of smell it in the air.
Walter Washington was mayor of D.C. He eventually became the city's first elected mayor. He imposed a curfew, but not before, get this, 13 people killed, 1,000 people injured, over 6,000 people arrested, and the property damage in the billions of dollars.
After the sadness, frustration, and anger set in, and I believe the first brick was thrown in the People's Drug Store at 14th and U.
Virginia Ali today is probably one of the best known people in all of Washington. Back then, she was a young woman in her 30s, and along with her husband, Ben Ali, they were running a small restaurant store.
And we were pretty well established in the community. Ben did right on that window in the big marker, Soul Brother.
Soul Brother.
Yeah, that identified us as a black-owned business. I think other people did it as well.
You see that guy right there? Do you recognize him?
Yes, I do.
Bobby Walker babysat me the night of Martin Luther King's death in that rectory, opened up the drapes and said, "You ain't going nowhere tonight."
Bobby Walker was a member of a Catholic church, St. Paul and St. Augustine, right there in the area. And when the riots broke out, he immediately, with some of his friends, surrounded the church and the pastor there, Father Ray Kemp.
The kids from the neighborhood would not let the priests go out and see this because they didn't want anything to happen to us.
How long were you hunkered down here
About,
at St. Augustine?
We walked out at 2 a.m., 2:30 in the morning. There were flames licking the sky. It felt to me like we had been bombed along 14th Street.
I think for the black community, it was what made these communities erupt was that people just thought there was no way, they had no other recourse.
A lot of people who've arrived in D.C. in the last 20 or so years, they don't know much about Frank Smith, and his soft voice can be deceiving, but Frank Smith was a young warrior.
Well, I moved to Washington, D.C. in January of 1968, having completed 6 years of service in Mississippi in the Civil Rights Movement with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. picketing and marching and going to jails, to some of the best jail houses in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia.
He was a young member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC.
I'd seen a lot by then. I was in Mississippi when Meg Edwards got killed. I was there when I went to the funeral for the 4 girls that got bombed in Birmingham. You know, I've seen a lot of tragedy.
Frank Smith says he wasn't surprised when he heard that Dr. King had been killed. And from talking to him, I gather he didn't think Martin Luther King was all that surprised that he was going to be killed.
Dr. King had moved from Montgomery, Alabama, because his house was bombed. His family was bombed there. Moved his family to Atlanta so he could to make them a little bit safer. He chose to stay, and he chose to stay and fight because he believed it was his mission. It was his calling.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Last night at this time, we examined the riots that erupted in the nation's capital following the murder of Dr. King. 50 years later, and you might not recognize the very same neighborhoods. Most of the businesses are recent. Many of the residents are young and white. A lot of racial issues remain a half century after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated.
It's unbelievable. It is unbelievable. Total shock, total transformation.
We have parents that bring their kids here to show them how cool they are. And we have kids that bring their parents here to show them what DC looks like.
But the neighborhood is thriving, and if you'll come out on a Friday or Saturday night after midnight, you'll think you're on Broadway.
By any measure, DC is on a roll. 1,000 new residents moving into the city every month. And they're moving into former riot corridors, too, like Columbia Heights and 14th Street.
And a lot of them are coming in this area because you got all these brand new buildings and whatnot, you know, and then we have a lot of new commerce up here. We got a movie theater and stuff like that, nightclubs, you know, so it's a nice area.
Hello, good.
Rick Lee is owner of Lee's Flowers, and he really appreciates the new business.
A lot of foot traffic, right. Saturdays and Sundays, folk are just, it's like a promenade, you know, there's up and down the street.
50 years ago, Rick and his family were huddled inside the shop, ready to fight off any of the rioters who were on the outside, still angry because Martin Luther King had been killed.
We didn't know whether we would get burned out or not because we were in here all night long trying to protect the place. You know, I have a shotgun up in here, and we wrote Soul Brother on the window and whatnot, and so we were like ready in case something jumped off.
And just a few steps down U Street, Ben's Chili Bowl and the Industrial Bank of Washington, those two businesses were African-American owned, and they were also spared that night.
The area declined. The area went into a decline when those businesses didn't reopen, and the middle class began to move away.
For us, we just never left. And for us, our customers never left. Through the riots, through the drugs.
B. Dole Mitchell is president of the bank, founded in 1934 by his grandfather.
After the riots, you had businesses that moved. You know, the nightclubs and the restaurants weren't there anymore. And then the drugs set in because you had lots of poverty in the 70s.
For decades after the riots, drugs and prostitution were a big part of the economy. Unemployment had gone through the roof. Blacks who could fled to the suburbs. From 1968 until 1998, the city's overall population, get this, dropped by 200,000 people.
Here where we are right now at 14th and V, even up to 2005, when we first opened Busboys and Poets, the block between 14th and 13th Street was actually crack houses.
Andy Shalal, an Iraqi-American, moved to the U.S. with his family back in 1966. They lived in Arlington, Virginia, but he, as a young teenager, managed to sneak into the district.
Coming to 14th Street was not something you tell your mother you're gonna do. You know, it was a place for drug dealing, open market drug dealing, prostitution.
But why did you want a business right here?
Well, all of this history was being lost, I think, as things were changing in the city. Lots of people moving in that didn't know anything about civil rights in the city, that didn't know anything about the relationship of DC to the civil rights movement.
Andy Shalal called his restaurant Busboys and Poets to honor some of the great black poets and playwrights of the Harlem Renaissance, people like Langston Hughes.
But it was also known as Chocolate City, which was a city predominantly black and has a very strong black culture, a city of music, a city of poetry, a city of literature and reading. And I just felt like somebody needs to preserve that.
He wanted his restaurants, now he's got quite a few, to be places where people of different cultures could gather.
Honestly, I couldn't get any partners because no one buy into the idea of what I was trying to do because it's so unique and so personal. For me, being not on the white team or not on the black team either made me kind of uniquely situated that I can actually look at the absurdity of race, the ridiculousness of race in America. And for me, Martin Luther King's assassination 50 years ago was my introduction to race in America.
The one financial institution willing to lend money to Busboys and Poets in the beginning was the Industrial Bank of Washington, the same bank that kept Ben's Chili Bowl and Lee's Flowers afloat during the tough times. Expensive housing going up all over the place. Why is it so expensive?
Demand. You still have 1,000 people moving into the District of Columbia every month.
The district's population has grown. It's now at 700,000 residents. But 50 years after Martin Luther King's assassination and the riots, this is no longer Chocolate City. Blacks are no longer a majority of the population. There is no racial majority. That bothers a lot of people, but not everybody.
Race determines everything in America, even today. It determines where you live, it determines your health, it determines your wealth, it determines who your friends are, it determines where you go out to eat. Everything is revolved around race, and yet we continue to deny that race is something that we just imagine in our heads. It's not. It's very real and very effective, and it affects people in a very, very serious way. And unless we talk about it, unless we actually open up the dialogue, we will never become that post-racial society that everybody dreams about.